This is the S2G podcast, where we share conversations that help us understand how to scale the food, agriculture, oceans, and energy transitions. I'm your host, Tanya Bekritzis. In this episode, Sanjeev Krishnan sits down with Regine Clement, CEO of the Creo Syndicate, and Tom Rotherham-Winkvist, co-founder of Featherlight Capital. They discuss their work in meeting asset owners and the role they could play in what we call the climate finance relay race. As a reminder, this content is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, business, tax, or investment advice, or be used to evaluate any investment or security, and is not directed at any investor or potential investor in any investment vehicle sponsored by S2G. Investing involves risk, including the risk of loss. Specific companies mentioned in this podcast are for educational purposes and should not be construed as an endorsement of any kind. Please note that S2G may maintain investments in some of the companies discussed on this podcast. For more important information, please see s2gventures.com/disclosures. This week, we launched a report called the Climate Finance Relay Race. It explores how asset owners are navigating what we call the climate megatrend and their rationale for their approach. Asset owners, such as family offices, pensions, insurers, and sovereign wealth funds, represent over $250 trillion in wealth. We believe how they allocate that money drives the future of economies and companies. They have the potential to increase climate investment levels by orders of magnitude, even with small marginal changes. But the spectrum of asset owner involvement in climate finance is highly varied and currently siloed. Asset owners face market and organizational barriers to investing more in this space. And we see a missing middle in that the capital markets are significantly skewed towards early stage or infrastructure-focused funds, with limited available capital at the growth stage. Enter what we're calling the climate finance relay race, or the handoff of risk and reward across parties required to scale the climate transition. We believe developing an enabling ecosystem that supports asset owners' associations with climate opportunities could enhance the coordination of this relay race to underwrite climate investing. This is why our managing partner, Sanjeev Krishnan, wanted to talk with Tom Rotherham-Winkvist and Regine Clement, who are both conveners of asset owners. Regine is the president and CEO of the Creo Syndicate, a nonprofit organization that helps large asset owners and their membership community, which consists of family offices and foundations, invest in climate solutions. Tom is the co-founder of Featherlight Capital, a platform focused on providing catalytic capital, advice, and support to climate-focused general partners. Regine and Tom each have a distinct bird's-eye view of the motivations and considerations of some of the most critical players in climate investing today. They discuss the megatrends that their respective constituents are interested in, where family offices and institutional capital intersect, and what it will take to create fit-for-purpose capital markets that can effectively fund the climate transition. There are few better people than Sanjeev, Tom, and Regine to zoom out and consider how all these pieces of the relay race puzzle come together.
Welcome to the podcast. Today I'm joined by two of my favorite people, Regine and Tom. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But I think the conversation that we hope to inspire today is to talk about where we are in terms of asset owners, so family offices, pensions, insurance, sovereign wealth funds, and others. What is a top of mind for them? Where do they want to deploy capital? What are the mega trends they're interested in? How does food, energy, ocean, and the broader transition play a role in that thinking? And then how does, if you think about these transitions going from the need to go from billions and trillions, especially at this moment in where we are, both from a climate perspective as well as an economic growth perspective globally, how does that portend in the future? Regine and Tom, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Yeah, I've been on the listening end for so many of these. Great to be speaking.
So one of my favorite movies is When Harry Met Sally. So I'm a rom-com person. And when Harry's driving Sally, I think they're hitching a ride from Chicago to New York, he asks a very, I think, profound question that I use a lot, which is, tell me the story of your life. So maybe, Regine, I'll start with you. Tell me the story of your life, how you got to where you are today. And then, Tom, I'm going to do the same for you. And then hopefully we can get started from there.
Great. Thanks again for having me. All right, story of my life. Grew up in Canada and was really interested in working on hard problems from day one. I always have. Every school project, university projects. And I felt strongly that to solve big problems, I would do that through government. And so spent several years working in government and policy and trade development. And I got very lucky. I ended up at the Canadian Consulate in New York running construction, infrastructure, and energy for Canada and the US. And this was under the tenure of Michael Bloomberg, who had launched Plan NYC in 2007. And that plan just made my jaw drop. It was the first time that I saw a comprehensive plan around trying to solve a big problem that really looked at several levers to essentially help New York figure out how it would deal with a million more in population over the next 10 years. And my aha moment there was that sustainability is a lens, and you can apply it to pretty much every business activity, investment, what have you. So with that, I was inspired to launch an accelerator program in clean tech. And that was going very well until one day the financial crisis hit. And then all investors ran away from clean tech, except for family offices. And I didn't know what a family office was. With my immense curiosity, started researching family offices, understanding who they were and why they could be contrarian in their strategy of investment. And that behavior was interesting enough for me to leave 17 years of my career in government and try something completely new, dare to be an entrepreneur myself, and found, I guess, my tribe in this network called Creo Syndicate, which was a group of about 20 family offices who were investing in clean tech. And my idea was, could you bring an accelerator model that I had used and developed with entrepreneurs and bring it to investors so that the investment community could really do their best work in investing in this space, knowing that the future would look different, that this climate problem and sustainability problem would only grow, and that at some point investors would wake up and start investing in this space. And we wanted to make sure that we had enough data and practice and standardization so that investors could come in easily. And today we know, and at least these are WEF numbers, we lose about 12% of GDP per 1 degree Celsius increase, which is tremendous loss. It is affecting livelihoods, we know, and communities around the world. We have to move fast, and finance is a big part of this puzzle, and we need to activate it now. We need to get from billions to trillions, in your words, Sanjeev, and that's what we're working on at Creo.
You're a force of nature, I find. And is that something you've had throughout your career, meaning you own the problem and not just the task, if you will? Or is that something that you found while being CEO of Creo?
Yeah, I think I don't want to regret anything in my life. I think pathways come for a reason. I do think I've always been an entrepreneur at heart. As I'm working with my daughter who's preparing for college applications, and we talk about her skill set, I think back in high school, who I was as a person in high school. And I was always that leader, driving people to do more, organizing, making sure we meet our deadlines, and really making sure we always go beyond our goals. And meeting our goals was just never good enough for me. I'm hardworking, passionate about what I do, and I couldn't be happier working on a bigger problem. Climate is an existential problem, and it's a big problem, and it takes a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders, and that is something that really interests me. And I see the possibilities in people in solving for this problem. I think we can do it. It just takes a lot of goodwill, good skill set, people working together and doing it.
Tom, I think as I was getting to know Regine, you and I met and put on an event together while you were at LTIO. But tell me the story of your life. I didn't realize this, but I have 2 Canadians on it. Right?
You have 2 Canadians on board, yeah. So, yeah, Regine, I grew up in Canada. Unlike Regine, where she saw a big world of possibilities from the beginning, I saw the world because I was thrown into it as a result of a referendum that happened just as I was graduating from university. In Quebec, and there weren't a lot of jobs with political uncertainty. And so I ended up working in a national park in Uganda, of all places.
As
And
one does.
I thought, as one does, yeah, it's actually not something I didn't share that story with people in finance and financial services until Teresa Whitmarsh, who was the head of Washington State Investment Board for many years, shared with me that she also started her career in national parks. And I thought, if Teresa started in national parks and ended up where she ended up, then maybe it's okay to have that origin story myself. But so I went from Uganda, ended up in Geneva. So the first sort of core part of my career was in Geneva doing international trade, investment, and sustainable development policy work. So similar to Regine, starting with policy. The insight that the organization I worked for, which is like a insider think tank, let's say, was that trade liberalization needed an objective. Trade liberalization for the purposes of trade liberalization wasn't a rationale for doing something or a guiding principle. And so sustainable development should be and needed to be that guiding principle. And that was the core of the work in Geneva, was trying to figure out how trade and investment policy could work to the objective of sustainable development. The second stage of my career started at INSEAD, where I was not a student. I got the network, but not the education, I guess. But I was working in one of the research departments while my wife was studying there. And INSEAD was in the process of pivoting towards corporate sustainability in terms of some of their executive education and the MBA. So I was working in the research department, helping them figure some of that out, and then moved to London and was doing corporate sustainability advisory work for a number of years, which led me to understanding how much corporates care about investors and what investors want to know and why do they want to know it, and closing that information gap. And that took me to finance. So for the last 15 years, I've been working in finance on the asset owner side, two organizations which were sort of asset managers, 100% owned by the largest pension funds in their respective countries, the UK and Kuwait. And in between those two bookends of working for an asset manager owned by a pension fund, I worked for a really fascinating, where we met, a group of large pensions and sovereigns that were looking to figure out how to innovate their models through collaboration. And so collaboration and convening has been an important part of my career and my life and what I really enjoy. And I think it's been a key point to how you understand and then address complex system-wide problems.
How much did moving to Uganda? Because I think you're a humble person. You're also one of the best at relationship management and curating kind of clarity with relationship. And then I think a lot of those people that are very good at EQ, I feel like have been an outsider in places and have been able to read body language and context. And how much of that was being in Uganda? What gave you the EQ that you have, which I think to me I think is one of your superpowers.
That's kind. Look, my job in Uganda was to figure out literally how to draw the line between animals and people. It was a lot easier to talk to the people than it was to the animals. But at that time in my life, I was more empathetic to the animals than the people, let's say. And from the beginning, it was how do we compromise and how do we find a balance? And you can't really get there unless you can get honesty and openness through people, through a trusted relationship. And that's the case for anything, whether that was trying to figure out how China should integrate into the world trade system, which the organization I was with worked on. Understanding people's hopes and fears is pretty important to figuring out how you can get compromise and agreement. So.
I think what's interesting through line that both of you had is you had both policy trade lens, which is really around politics, and then you both gravitated to capital, which obviously also has its own power dynamic in addition to policy. And I think maybe just because I want to go into mega trends, where are the asset owners today? Where are they putting money to work? And then maybe this conversation on the transition in that context. But Regine and Tom, maybe just talk about the current organization you're with, your mission, just for the audience that may not know Creo in detail, or Tom, what Featherlight is trying to do and what you're trying to do right now in your career. And then that sets the stage for, I think, what to me is an exciting conversation on asset owners and mega trends and how this fits in.
Yeah, thanks for the question. What we're trying to do at Featherlight is what's been the last sort of 8 years of my life in financial services, and most of what I get excited about is how do you innovate? But in the context of asset owners, innovation works best when you change as little as possible to get a meaningfully different outcome. And one of the things that we thought we saw, and then thanks to some fantastic research that Creo Advisory did, helped us to see more clearly, was that part of the solution to flowing capital into climate opportunities is going to be emerging managers, new solutions for new problems. And I had the great privilege and joy of spending 5 years working at sort of one of the original sort of emerging manager GP stake catalyzer platform, Capital Constellation at Wafra, and saw that this could be it's not a huge change to a model, but it can really catalyze change in the marketplace. And this is one area. There's a lot of areas that are needed we can get into, but making it possible for emerging managers to know how to succeed and then succeed seems like a worthwhile way to focus my time. So that's what we're trying to do at Featherlight.
Thanks, Tom. Regine, tell us the latest on Creo.
Sure. So at Creo, we're similar goals to Tom. We're essentially trying to catalyze capital into climate solutions and the transition. And we're doing this with, I think, a unique model, and that is working with a unique type of asset owner, which are family offices, as I discussed, and providing them with the tools they need to be able to invest successfully, both for impact and return into this space. Why going from government policy and trade into finance is because the capitalist system and the financial industry is a really effective tool to do things. And it is an interesting platform to transform. And I do think we can transform it to move towards investing for returns and good of the planet and good of the people. But to do this, there's a lot of levers that you have to tackle at the same time. And so you can't tackle them. Not one organization, I think, can tackle them all at once. And the question is, where do you start? And family offices in the realm and group of asset owners have very unique characteristics. One, they're essentially led by people with a different set of values, right? And so these families who we're working with have made a intentional decision that they want to leverage their investment capital to bring positive change around the problem of climate and sustainability. And typically when a family makes a decision, it sticks. Unlike in other asset owners, you might have a champion who moves around, goes to another organization. So that is something that is really unique because you typically have a long-term commitment of direction by the leadership. Second, even first-generation families and, of course, multi-generational families think in generations. And so they do think in short, medium, and long-term. Asset owners have the capability of thinking long-term, but regulated and institutional capital still have some rigidity around that and around the concept and interpretation of fiduciary duty, for example. And so families can, for generational purposes, see a different future and want to align with it. Families have interesting assets to work with. They have family offices to deploy capital. They have family foundations to do philanthropic capital. They also own most of the private economy. So they have businesses that they can also move to transition towards a lower carbon world. And so they're a very interesting group of people and teams to work with. And as we bring the acceleration model to investors, it really is, to your point, having a high EQ. It's really understanding people. With institutional capital, it's a little bit different. There's also understanding people and systems. With family offices, it's a little bit more about people. And so what do they need to be able to move faster? And we've put together a kind of core activities in Creo that is a mix of research, educational programming, community development, talk about the hard things, talk about the great things, and share more than you would normally in a competitive environment. And then I think what is very unique to Creo is that we went a step further as a nonprofit and added deal origination. That is where the rubber hits the road. We educate on various thematics, but then we overlay that with opportunities in the marketplace today so that what you learn, you can action today. And of course, you can't learn everything overnight. We see different ways that families come into this space, and we'll talk about that later. But we have found that these engagement strategies have led us to create an organization where we're working with well over 200 families who all time have invested in 1,700 companies, in over 400 funds, which is wonderful because this investment creates a bit of a volume and norm setting within the family office community.
Thank you. I think you alluded to this. So the way we think about this is asset owners have an enormous impact on the overall, global system. According to our research, about 250 trillion of assets. A good chunk of that, Tom, are in pensions, sovereigns, insurance, endowment foundations. Obviously, there's a very large chunk to families as well. But one of the things that one of my mentors taught me is you go long secular trends and short broken business models. Tom, you've been in this world for a while in terms of asset owners on the institutional side, pensions, sovereigns, et cetera. What are the mega trends that they're talking to you about and wanting to invest behind? Just agnostic to this conversation, just in general. What are the things that they're looking at for their stakeholders?
Yeah. So maybe two quick points before I get into the answer. The first is the idea that we're going to use finance to fix the natural system or the real world without putting some attention into fixing the financial services system itself, I think there's some challenge, right? So I think one has to look at the financial services system as a system that also needs to improve, particularly when new challenges are thrown at it. And from that perspective, the asset owners are at the top of the capital chain, right? After the global financial crisis, John Kay, who's a FT journalist and a professor, was asked by the UK government to write a report on what went wrong. And his conclusion was the financial services system, which fundamentally is meant to serve savers and entrepreneurs, risk takers, got captured a little bit by the agents. And that's not just for greed. That's not for evilness. That's because of the way the system works. It relies on incomplete lines of accountability and information sharing, et cetera, et cetera. But that was one of his conclusions. So I think that's a really important context to keep in mind. Now, that said, what are asset owners paying attention to? Interest rates, longevity, which is their liability side if you're a pension. They're looking at geopolitics. They're looking at anything that changes the future is something that asset owners are going to want to pay attention to. And some of those are more predictable and go through more regular patterns and regular cycles. And some of them are less predictable. Geopolitics is very unpredictable. And so the question is, what can you anticipate with enough confidence to bring it into your decision-making process? And then secondly, are there any of those things whose outcome you can actually influence through decision-making processes? And that it's credible for you to do that. And I think that's where climate is a fascinating one. Because unlike geopolitics, where most pension funds would say, well, it's not my business to get involved in politics. It's something I need to anticipate and understand. Climate change is an area where actually through the deployment of your capital, you can have an impact on the outcome. And that's why I think it's so interesting and so challenging for asset owners.
One of the things that I'm obsessed by is productivity, because change in demographics times change of productivity equals GDP growth, just loosely, just as a framework. We've had the last 30 years enormous demographic dividends with the boomers coming of age and creating a lot of wealth and spending that wealth. You've had India and China come out of that. Obviously now you have aging happening all over. And so you need this productivity. Is productivity and the future productivity a framework that asset owners on the institutional side can get behind? Or do they see climate as more of a risk? Because I'm cognizant that it's hard to really think of climate as anything similar to an interest rate or longevity or geopolitics. Natural resource productivity is something that I think recognizes a need. How do asset owners think about productivity, or do they think about it at all from the institutional side?
I think the question is at what level do they think about it? And for climate change, the thinking about it needs to affect the actual capital deployment almost at the asset level. And I think where pension funds, sovereign funds think about productivity is more in the macroeconomic forecasting. And it doesn't necessarily drip down into the asset selection, which is fundamentally what the challenge on the climate capital deployment. So I think that's probably what I'd say to that.
Okay. So, Regine, Tom talked about interest rates, Tom talked about demographics and longevity, geopolitics, the future. How are your stakeholders thinking about megatrends in general?
In general, I would say they're the same as institutional capital. I would say that because our community focuses specifically on climate and sustainability, I would draw a step down and look at kind of the mega trend of climate, the mega trend of sustainability. And just to answer your question on productivity, in at least our community's perspective, it is an element that drives investment decision when you believe that climate will force us to move into new ways of production and to generate energy. And so, in that sense, productivity is very much on our members' minds, especially around things right now and mining and minerals. And how will we make sure that we have what we need to do this transition, which requires a huge move to renewable energy? So, in that context, productivity is a very important element and key consideration in investing. That brings it from the macro to the micro. But if you don't already have a commitment or intention around climate, it's a harder one to create that throughway, is how I would answer that question. But in terms of mega trends, I would say that in our community, it's around climate and sustainability, but also how do you link leading with climate and sustainability to other co-benefits that are very important to our families, things around DEI and social outcomes, job creation, and really how does climate and sustainability fit into the broader considerations that are required for this transition to happen. It's not only about the brown to green or the solutions in green. It is how do you create the talent? How do you align government policy? How do you accelerate technology innovation? How do you leverage things like AI to support climate, right? So those are the themes that a lot of our members are thinking about. But again, they're generally co-benefits to the work around climate and sustainability.
So I want to get to the moment we're in because you guys are both active market participants in sort of the investment world and have a good perch. But just the way that I wanted to frame this leg of the conversation is we are framing it at S2G as productivity. How do these products and services provide increased productivity, efficiency, as well as lower volatility? And if you look at the last 4 big productivity cycles, railroad, electricity, oil, and polymers computing, all of them had innovation, business model innovation, some sort of policy, civil society buy-in. But the fourth ingredient was around a fit-for-purpose capital market system that really financed the productivity cycle, whether it's in energy, food and ag, oceans, or many others. That fit-for-purpose capital system led to the advent of venture capital. All of the free enterprise formation led to venture capital as an asset class. In the landscapes you work in, do you feel like today we have a fit-for-market capital market system to fund the transition? And if not, like what are the key frictions you see, maybe from an asset owner level, that are preventing more capital from going from billions to trillions?
Okay, so I guess the first thing I'd say is a pension or a sovereign, they need to solve for a lot of different things, not just one thing. And while I think you'd say a pension fund's fundamental goal is to pay their liabilities and pay pensioners incomes, and the sovereign's fundamental role is to be able to provide backstop capital for a country. They're pretty complex, and I'm not sure that a pension fund or a sovereign fund is fit for any individual purpose. They're fit for a complex set of purposes. And yeah, that's my top level comment. Specific to climate, no, I don't think it's fit for purpose, but simply because of the speed at which it needs to operate. The fundamental challenge on climate is not that something has to change. As you've said before, Sanjeev, the world's been changing for 10,000 years, applying energy to make something less useful into something more useful and applying, capitals of different kinds to get that to happen. So capital markets will change. Of course, they'll evolve. The challenge is how does that happen at speed and at scale? And an analogy that I use a lot is digitization. If the internet bubble burst and Clean Tech 1.0 burst, and then you had all these interesting sort of productivity enhancing things that came out of it, would it really have fundamentally changed the world if it took an extra decade for sort of the innovations from the clean tech bubble to have seeped into economies would have been worse for productivity, wouldn't have fundamentally changed the future of the planet. But that is where we are with climate. And so I think that's the fundamental challenge is no, of course it's not fit for purpose. It can become fit for purpose, but the question is across what time scale and how do we accelerate that time scale?
Yeah, I would say it's an interesting question. My belief is that the market will respond because this opportunity is already here and growing at a certain pace, right? We're seeing, I think it was 1.4 trillion deployed into climate. We need to be at 8 today, depending on which model you look at, but anywhere between 6 and 8 or 10, right? Clearly, there's a gap. And we just don't have time for private capital to take its time to respond. And it will respond as cost curves go down. We have seen technologies hit the J curve and be capitalized, solar, EV, onshore wind. But there is a long tail of many technologies that need to come online that are not scaling fast enough. And part of it is because they're not getting the right capital at the right time. And because time is of the essence, I do believe that there are several interventions that need to happen if we want, to your kind of word, have a fit for purpose financial industry. And what's complicated with climate, it's not a sector. So in the world of asset allocation, even as an asset owner, you're divided in silos, sector silos and asset class silos. And climate really fits everywhere in a way. And not only that, to scale fast, these different asset classes and sectors need to interact because there's a bit of a handoff in a way in certain sort of situations.
Perhaps
when you're looking
you can call it a relay race.
I was going to say it's unsheep, but I didn't want to feel it. So I'll call it a relay race. And this is the problem. And so when we think about what are these friction points or misalignments, there are many at the systems level. I'm not sharing anything that's new. There's a knowledge gap. This is at the board, CEO, CFO, CRO, chief risk officer, and investor and asset allocators level. There's a capacity gap, and this is on the governance side of whether it's a family office, a pension fund, a sovereign fund, and they all look different. So this changes across the type of asset owner a little bit. The way a lot of institutional investors, they get asset allocation direction for a period of time is very difficult to quickly shift and pivot to react to the market when time is of the essence. You've got really a lack of data. You asked about, is institutional thinking risk versus opportunity? And what's interesting is some of the family offices and institutional are investing in climate, but they're not necessarily calling it climate, right? A lot of them have renewable energy because it's not a category. So how do you bring that in a structure that is rigid for a reason is definitely a challenge. And then how do these models where you're trying to scale technology into infrastructure, where there's these blended strategies, first of a kind project financing, one of the elements of the missing middle is a really hard one because these are new technologies. They're new to investors who haven't been doing early stage technology investing in VC. And we just don't have the tools or the data, right? They want 7 to 10 years of data. We don't have time to have 7 to 10 years of data to write a good project debt proposal, right? So it's like, where can the system adjust and find workarounds to better understand risk and manage that risk is necessary. The last thing I'll say is that we live in a world of quote unquote cancellation, and it's really hard for people to be leaders. And unfortunately, climate has been politicized. And so there's a lot of great will and people who want to do great work, but often they do it in discrete matters because of this dynamic. And the successes are not being talked about as much as they should be to encourage others to see the success and the performance data, et cetera, to then be able to follow. So those are just some of the many friction points and misalignments that we're looking at.
And Tom, I want to bring this to life. If you're a listener out there that's an entrepreneur that's building a company, or you're a potential co-investor with us, or just building an investment platform, why is it important to understand institutional capital, Because a lot of people may be hearing this conversation. This doesn't really matter to me. Potentially, it's at such a high level. Why is it important to understand the frictions, the empathy for the people that work in these institutions if we really want to unlock the capital for these entrepreneurs and these projects?
Yeah, and we're implicitly on this call, I think, talking about private markets. I think the reason for that is because that's where it's primary capital and where it can be most directed and where the link between the financial services world and the real world is most proximate. Like it's the degrees of separation as opposed to some macro hedge fund strategies where it's unclear how that is affecting something that's happening in a warehouse somewhere. Ultimately, the GPs that are mentioned, the vast majority of their capital is coming from pension funds, sovereign funds, insurance companies, endowment foundations, the vast majority. And the degree to which the source of that capital has got views on the world, that's going to affect not only who gets the money, but also what they get to use it for. Because obviously those mandates that if you want 10-year money, you need to put some pretty clear bounds around that so that people know what you're going to be using it for. And understanding the friction points, understanding the perspective and the way the asset owners see the world is an insight into what capital is going to be available for the entrepreneur.
But I'd say, if I can jump in, this is where the world of family offices and institutional can intersect, right? It's families can choose to deploy the type of capital they want into the deal they want at the time they want. They do have that flexibility. And that's extremely important in the world of climate. And this is why we're building a working group around first of a kind financing to start building data around it. And then from what we're hearing with our collaborative agreement with Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which is mostly pension funds and insurers, that performance data is key, right? So this idea that there's many things families can do, but this de-risking is an important one, and trying to see if we can connect those dots is a lot of the work that we're trying to do. It's not clear yet how that will look like, but I think it is a pathway that's useful to explore.
Yeah, I think before we start wrapping up, one final sort of non-conclusion question is we are in a bit of an air pocket. Don't call it Clean Tech 2.0 yet. Because we did not build a fit-for-purpose system, a lot of the FOIC stuff was not built, a lot of multi-asset, which is probably needed to fund a lot of these first-of-a-kind. You're seeing a wave of bankruptcies across these sectors because they don't have access to that customized capital to really fund that CapEx and then deliver that cash flow. And so I think it makes this work and problem even more important. I guess maybe Tom and then Regine, if you're going to build a de-risking assembly line, that first leg is a lot of the first-time fund LPs, a lot of early stage investors, whether it's in infrastructure or in innovation, where I've always been vexed on what does the second leg and third leg look like? How do we get from early to scale? Again, from the perspective, Tom, maybe you, of the asset owner that has all of these other considerations in terms of meeting their contribution to their pensioners, what does it need to look like for them to say yes to this and then no to something else?
I think the challenge with your average asset owner is that at the end of the day, it's a decision-making process. And so what you want to do is you want to try and create a decision-making process that's based on data points and you get better at making decisions, deciding which data points to pay more attention to and less in different situations. The data points are fundamentally backward-looking, right? And measures of risk are fundamentally backwards-looking. The opportunity is forward-looking. And so the system doesn't work as well in building confidence around the future as it does the past, or around opportunities as it does around risk. And that's part of the challenge. I think fundamentally, what does it need to look like to make it something that people can invest in, thinking about first of a kind? Making it safe for the individual and the organization to bet on the future is a core part of that. The internal principal agency within an organization is pretty acute. And there's a lot of people I know who are in pension fund seats, some who have left for family offices actually, because they're like, I don't feel like we can move fast enough. And what they're saying is, I don't feel like I've been given the freedom to deliver the mandate that my board has given me, which is put X% into climate or whatever it is. And so I think an important part of what needs to happen is for people to be given the freedom to bet on the future And there's only so much that you can change the risk reward function. Now, people are taking steps. There's a UK pension fund that I won't name because I haven't gone public with it yet, that are doing a blended private market at a different benchmark return to help it make it easier for the team to be like, okay, if we have to hit this bogey, not this bogey, it's fine, we can go ahead and do it. The innovation is happening, but I think those are the kinds of innovations. If we try and start saying, well, no, the real world has to change to fit finance, where we get into this problem to begin with.
I think there are different pathways. I don't think this relay race is one relay race. I feel there's like multiple relay races on different thematics. And the way I see it, one, we need to work with more family offices. So really get more AUM by family offices to understand how they can generate alpha and de-risk at the same time. And this is de-risking tech, de-risking projects, de-risking emerging managers, and de-risking emerging markets, right? That's how we think about the role of CREO members in the de-risking element. And in that case, there can be a handoff in a way, right? So in VC and growth, we have seen institutionals come into rounds at even Series B, C, D, E. So that is one kind of pathway to the relay race. Now, of course, with some of the challenges in the marketplace and the high valuations and that correction, I think that's an important reminder to entrepreneurs to be disciplined with how they grow their companies, right? So these are cycles. They've happened before. I don't believe we're in the same place that we were in Clean Tech 101. There's a lot more knowledge. There's a lot more capital. There's a lot more commitment. To your point, Tom, around creativity, I see working with institutional asset owners who have the appetite for innovation, and there are some. In fact, there are quite a few. And it is about continuing to work with them for them to continue to forge forward around this innovation, whether it's creating a carve out around energy transition, right? We have seen pension funds have a carve out that is multi-asset class around energy transition, for example. And with those, there is, I think, opportunity to look at infrastructure asset class projects. Even we've seen some of our families who have family-owned businesses who are trying to transition their businesses, whether they're trying to decarbonize their businesses, shipping businesses or energy businesses, or trying to pivot their business. We've seen situations where our families will take in sovereign fund capital to shift and to transition the business. So I don't know if it's an exact relay race handoff, but there's a collaboration there. And as we build these companies over time, there's an opportunity for families to own these businesses as well as those pension funds that do like to be owners. There is a great opportunity for these pension funds to own these businesses over time. So again, it's not like a linear relay race. I think it really is more about where are opportunities for different asset owners to work together and own and hand off and continue to build together.
Sanjeev, can I just add one point? De-risking or getting paid for risk, right? And it all starts with understanding the risk. CREO and the family office community and the institutional pension sovereign community. Climate's the one area where asset owners have thought actually having some scars, having some failures, maybe that's a good thing because you've got some experience and you know what's gone wrong. People generally don't like failure, but at least there's some learning. And so what we need to figure out is I don't think you need to de-risk it. Maybe you do, but if people don't understand the risk and they don't know if they're getting paid for the risk, that's a more fundamental problem. And I think that's where a lot of people are. And so bringing people together to share the learning, that's how we're going to accelerate action, from accelerate learning, from accelerating relationship building, from people who want to learn and can help teach. That's a bit of a pitch for CREO's work. For that.
Yeah, and Tom, it's a great point because it's true that we call it de-risking, but in some cases, de-risking for alpha, right? You're taking bigger risk for bigger alpha because the family is an operator in a certain area, really has a unique edge to be able to manage that risk. Again, I want to remind everyone that CREO is primarily commercial investing, right? We're not in the business of de-risk. Our families do de-risk through philanthropy as well, but there is a de-risking element with alpha-seeking strategies, and those two can exist.
Yeah, I think as the world thinks about beta, interest rates, longevity, geopolitics, the future is going to be some alpha that we don't know about. And I think you cannot escape environmental physics. We're seeing that physics be more volatile. And I think investing behind that both for better beta and more alpha is something that's important. And you both are leaders in the community that needs to be developed. So I want to thank you both for your leadership, for your friendship to S2G and our ecosystem. And thanks for being on the podcast today.
Tom and Regine have such a great grasp of the unique characteristics and needs of the investor classes they work with, but they are also able to appreciate and capitalize on the opportunities that exist at the intersection of these communities to further accelerate climate investment. We hope these conversations can spark some more ideas about what roles these different types of asset owners can play in this relay race and where those handoffs of risk and reward can happen. Thank you for tuning in to the S2G podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, or share it with a friend. For more information or to connect with us, check out s2gventures.com.